Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 4 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, in a half PPR scoring format, have been giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers on a weekly basis, in order to give ourselves more insight as to which wide receivers have the most advantageous matchups going into the week. After we'll cover the matchup section of today's video, then we'll transition into our top 36 wide receiver rankings, as I'll share with you guys statistics in order to justify the reasons as to how I have the wide receivers ranked top to bottom and how I think it's all going to pan out when it's all said and done at the end of Week 4. Before we begin, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel, of course, every single day with your viewership and, of course, clicking the like button down below. For those of you who have not yet already, help us get to 70,000 subscribers by clicking the subscribe button today. Again, we're extremely close to reaching our goal, and we're making daily fantasy football content for the singular purpose of trying to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So be sure to do so today. Thank you very much. Also, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy and are trying to play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, Underdog Fantasy is the best way to do so. There's a link down in the description of the video. If you travel to their website, you can go ahead and participate in their Thursday night contest where you draft flex players and go ahead and compete against others in order for the grand prize. Maybe you want to go ahead and test your luck in terms of the pick'ems game where you're picking higher or lower on a given player statistic. Perhaps you're interested in getting involved in this Thursday night contest between the Miami Dolphins and Cincinnati Bengals. If that's something that excites you, potentially you want to go ahead and take some pick'ems on players like Tyreek Hill. Again, if Jaylen Waddle, who's currently dealing with an injury, isn't going to play at a maximum capacity, imagine what Tyreek Hill can do, especially after calling out Eli Apple. There's a lot of potential there that he could produce higher than that 5.5 reception mark. Also, there's other pick'ems here that you can go ahead, get yourself involved in. If you're able to get a 5-leg pick'em slip, all accurately correct, higher or lower, you can 20 times your overall money. Check that out today, again, via Underdog Fantasy. The pick'ems that I really like for this weekend, and one that I'm continuing to kind of loop into my pick'em slips, I'll go ahead and scroll down, is the Chicago Bears quarterback and wide receiver combination of Justin Fields and Darnell Mooney. Again, Justin Fields has not played extremely well thus far this season. In fact, he only has, 24 overall passes completed thus far. In comparison to other offenses, they are far behind, and it's like record-breakingly bad in terms of how much passing efficiency and lack thereof we have seen from this offense. Obviously, Darnell Mooney has been a player that we have to avoid every single week, specifically talking about the wide receiver position. So I'm looking at both these potential plays being lower options going into Week 4. So again, if you're interested, check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. And when you sign up making a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So if you're interested, check that out. Thank you very much for supporting the channel. All right, let's begin with the wide receiver conversation, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right of me, we have how many points defenses have given up to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format in terms of the first 3 weeks of the season on average. Obviously, the Baltimore Ravens, they've had their hands full as their secondary hasn't been fully healthy, and they've faced up against some of the tougher wide receivers in the National Football League. We all remember that Week 2 explosion from Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. Even this last week, Devontae Parker had himself 156 receiving yards against that defense with only 5 catches on 10 targets. We know that the Baltimore Ravens secondary is struggling, and now they have to take on the Buffalo Bills receivers, Gabriel Davis, Stefon Diggs, Isaiah McKenzie. They're going to have their hands full, to say the very least. But of course, the Los Angeles Rams, they have definitely been struggling against opposing wide receivers, whether it is earlier in the game or even in garbage time, as well as the Washington Commanders, Tennessee Titans, Atlanta Falcons, Los Angeles Chargers, Detroit Lions. These are defenses that we want to start our wide receivers against. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, in terms of some of the tougher matchups, the Broncos, the 49ers, the Giants, the Bengals, these are defenses that have played extremely well against opposing wide receivers, or in some scenarios, haven't really been put to the test. If you look at their schedules from weeks 1 through 3, some of these teams haven't been tested to a maximum capacity, and when they have, they've given up a boatload of points. Either way, just putting this in perspective, we are going to go ahead and we're going to refer back to these statistics as we progress throughout the video. Every single player has a star designation next to their face so that you can get an idea as to where exactly we're looking at in terms of fantasy points allowed and what kind of a matchup it is. 1 star being the most difficult, 5 star being the easiest going into Week 4. All right, let's begin with our number 1, Cooper Kupp. Of course, remaining at the top of the throne, Cooper Kupp didn't have a great week, and I mentioned it last week. He has struggled the most since Matthew Stafford's arrival against the Arizona Cardinals. That has been a team that has certainly given him trouble, and his lowest fantasy point production has always come against them. Now, going into this upcoming week, he gets back on track and takes on a far easier matchup in the same division, taking on the San Francisco 49ers. In fact, in the last 3 games that he's taken on the San Francisco 49ers, the 2 regular season games in 2021 and the NFC Championship game, he has found himself a lot of success. In the regular season, 17.7 fantasy points, 23.1 in a half PPR. And in the NFC Championship game, 14 targets, 11 catches, 142 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 31 and a half PPR fantasy points. Of course, this is going to be all Cooper Kupp all day, and that's what it looks like in terms of what this offense is kind of leaning towards. He's obviously the number one. Moving on to Stefon Diggs, like I mentioned, he has the easiest matchup going into the week against the Baltimore Ravens secondary that has mightily struggled against opposing wide receivers. Of course, we have seen not only Tyreek Hill go for 190 receiving yards, Jaylen Waddle 171 in that same game. We also saw Devontae Parker for 156 receiving yards. We've seen a lot of wide receivers find success against this secondary. Now, going into week 4, we're still questioning whether or not Gabriel Davis is at a full capacity. If in fact he is going to be out there for a majority of the snaps but not get much utilization, they're going to continue to look in the direction of Stefon Diggs, who, as of thus far this season, is getting a boatload of targets, tied for first in the National Football League in terms of wide receiver targets. And as of late, in terms of yards per route run, he's number 3 amongst all wide receivers in the National Football League who have had themselves a wide spectrum of targets with a 2.94 yard per route run average. I mean, Stefon Diggs is a stud. I'm sure the Buffalo Bills want to get back on track with a W this week against an AFC rival. They should be having some fun this week, putting up a lot of fantasy points. Moving on, we have Ja'Marr Chase taking on the Miami Dolphins on Thursday night. Again, we are not 100% certain as to what exactly T. Higgins is dealing with. It is a toe injury. This is something that could end up holding him back, and there also may be a potential in which Joe Mixon is held back to an extent. But even with that all mentioned, we expect Ja'Marr Chase to still get a lot of opportunity within this offense. It is a good matchup, and in my opinion, what Ja'Marr Chase has already put forth thus far this season in terms of production doesn't really encompass what he is capable of doing. As of the first 3 weeks of the season, he has gone ahead and accumulated 35 targets. That is tied with Stefon Diggs and Cooper Kupp. No other wide receivers have more targets than those 3 receiving options. That's why they continue to be at the top of this list. As long as he's continuing to see double-digit targets every single week, I anticipate Ja'Marr Chase to continue to increase his overall baseline of production. Having scored 2 touchdowns in the first 3 games, I'm expecting those numbers to also go in the right direction. Overall, we already know that we're starting Ja'Marr Chase, just giving you more intel as to why we're so confident in doing so. Moving on, we have Justin Jefferson as our number 4. Justin Jefferson in the last 2 weeks has been MIA. Missing in action. Unfortunately, many of us have lost our fantasy contest because of his contributions. In the last 2 weeks, having only put up 7.8 and 2.9 half PPR fantasy points, it is quite disappointing. Yet, he is still the number 8 overall wide receiver in fantasy. Just putting that into perspective, he is still getting himself a decent amount of opportunity, and eventually he's going to get back on track. Whether it is this week or the week after, we have to continue to trust our stud wide receiver. He is going to maintain in our lineup, and hopefully, against the New Orleans Saints in London, we're going to find ourselves with Justin Jefferson having himself another massive week and helping our fantasy teams like we expect him to. Moving on to A.J. Brown, the thumbnail for today's video. A.J. Brown has been incredible. This offense for the Philadelphia Eagles has also been incredible. Now they have an opportunity of taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars, who's coming off of a hot win this last week against the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, if we continue to see the Philadelphia Eagles produce at their similar rate that they have in the last 2 weeks, I mean, we're talking about Jalen Hurts putting up back-to-back weeks of 300-plus passing yards. He was only able to accomplish that twice last season. He's done that in 2 of the first 3 games of 2022. On top of the fact that they're getting more utilization out of DeVonta Smith on the other side of the field, we're in a conversation where there are 2 threatening wide receivers in this offense and a mobile quarterback, and it is going to be extremely difficult to bottle all 3 of those guys up. And then once you do, this offensive line, Miles Sanders, they'll tear you apart. As of thus far this season, in the first 3 weeks, A.J. Brown has seen a 31.63% target share within this offense. He's continuing to lead, continuing to get himself, on an average of 10 targets per game. And if we're in that realm of possibility, expect A.J. Brown to continue to put up a great total of fantasy points. Moving on to Deebo Samuel. Now, Deebo Samuel has been pretty average, I would say, thus far this season. 10 to 12 points and a half PPR consistently. And he hasn't really killed us, but he hasn't been the Deebo of old. We haven't seen those explosive performances. Luckily, this week, he takes on the Los Angeles Rams. And typically, when he plays against the Rams, he finds himself putting up a lot of points. In fact, in the last 3 games that he played against them last season, 2 during the regular season and 1 during the playoffs, he averaged 24.19 fantasy points per game. Just to kind of give you a spectrum of what his averages looked like last season against the Rams. 6 targets, 4 receptions, 52 receiving yards. Not the greatest overall receiving work. 36 rushing yards on average against them, and 1.34 touchdowns per game. If you're going to be in that realm of possibility of scoring consistent touchdowns, getting the work on the ground like we're going to see because of Elijah Mitchell's absence, and get himself still a lot of receiving work because he knows how to dominate against his defense. I mean, the 49ers, Kyle Shanahan, they have beaten the Rams in 6 out of the last 7 games that they have faced against one another. I'm expecting Deebo Samuel to have himself a big performance this week as our number 6. Let's move on to number 7, Davante Adams. Listen, Davante Adams is a fantastic wide receiver. We both know that. But the issue is Derek Carr. Derek Carr has not been quite accurate in the opportunities that he has given Davante Adams. In fact, Davante Adams has yet to drop a ball this season. But in the 34 total targets that Davante Adams has gotten, he's only caught 17 of them. That is absolutely ridiculous. That's embarrassing. If we're going to continue on, we're going to have to see a far higher catch rate from Davante Adams. And that's going to, entail Derek Carr being a far better quarterback. It is a tough matchup this upcoming week against the Denver Broncos. They've got a pretty good secondary, but in my opinion, it only takes a couple more receptions here and there to make Davante Adams' week, every single week, a top 10 standing. I'm expecting the touchdown to accompany his performance, but ultimately, I'm expecting a little bit more accuracy. Now, when I talk about his red zone opportunities, it's going to be amongst the most in the league. In fact, thus far this season, in terms of touchdowns scored, he has scored 3 of them, and he's been the number 1 wide receiver in the red zone in terms of total targets, and he's the number 2 overall wide receiver in terms of targets inside the 10-yard line. As long as we're in that conversation, we're getting touchdowns. Derek Carr, you just need to step up your game and we're good to go. Moving on, we have Tyreek Hill as our number 8. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, they take on the Cincinnati Bengals defense, who they've played pretty well against opposing wide receivers, but have they truly been tested? I mean, looking at their first 3 games of their schedule, taking on, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the quarterback play wasn't great there. Just this last week, they took on the Jets. Quarterback play wasn't great there. They took on the Dallas Cowboys in week 2. Cooper Rush was the quarterback. Again, they haven't played against elite level quarterback play. And I'm not saying Tua is at that level, but we've got some elite level receiving talent that could end up pulling Tua to that level in this given week. As of this moment, we have Tyreek Hill talking a lot of smack about Eli Apple. The last time they took on each other was the AFC Championship game, in which Tyreek Hill had 10 targets, 7 catches, 78 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. If we're going to see something even close to that scoreline, we're going to be in a fantastic position this upcoming week. I'm anticipating a lot of scoring in this game Thursday night, hopefully a lot from Tyreek Hill. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. taking on the Tennessee Titans. It's obviously a fantastic matchup. All we really need to see is the Indianapolis Colts protect their quarterback. I mean, yes, he's a veteran, but he can get the job done if you protect him and you don't allow him to turn over the ball. Now, a couple things to mention. Earlier today, Wednesday, Jonathan Taylor didn't practice. Now, he's probably going to play, but if in fact they're going to have him at some sort of limited capacity, which I'm not, expecting to see, but if they do, that only helps Michael Pittman Jr. In fact, when we looked at Michael Pittman Jr.'s overall production against the Tennessee Titans last year, he had a game of 25.6 fantasy points and 10.3 total fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. So if you just go ahead and improve the quarterback position, get yourself into a contest in which the secondary is far lesser than Michael Pittman has faced in past weeks, I'm expecting a lot of production here for the young breakout wide receiver here in week 4. Moving on to Mike Evans. Welcome back, Mike Evans. You undeservedly got yourself a suspension, and it is what it is. You were protecting your quarterback, and now you're going to return in a matchup in which you take on the Kansas City Chiefs. Just want to mention again, do not forget, when Mike Evans has played full healthy games with Tom Brady in the last 3 years, 2020 through 2022, we have seen Mike Evans average 14.41 fantasy points per game. And as long as he continues to maintain as the number 1, and we have a question in regards to whether or not Julio Jones and Chris Godwin can even return this week, there's a lot of opportunity that is going to go in the direction of Mike Evans. I'm anticipating that to be the case. And of course, we know he is Tom Brady's number 1 red zone threat. And when they get down there, eventually, he's going to be scoring himself some touchdowns. It's going to be a fantastic game this week against the Kansas City Chiefs on Sunday Night Football, might I add. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown. As of right now, he is dealing with an injury, and his streak was officially broken. It was an 8-game streak, and it was unfortunate that it came to an end, but this last week had himself only 9 targets, just short of that 10 target range, 6 catches, unfortunately, a couple shy of that 8 reception range, 73 receiving yards, and no touchdowns. Quite unfortunate, only played 73% of the offensive snaps, but he has an opportunity to once again restart the streak. Taking on the Seattle Seahawks this week presents a huge opportunity to do exactly that, because last season, week 17, if you guys remember, in your championship games, Amon-Ra St. Brown won us championships with his performance against the Seattle Seahawks of 31.4 fantasy points. 11 targets, 8 catches, 111 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, 23 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. In that game, they didn't see much utilization out of DeAndre Swift. Well, luckily for Amon-Ra St. Brown, there is no DeAndre Swift in this game as well. There may be a conversation here where he's getting attempts out of the backfield, making himself, just a threat all over the field like he typically does. I think he gets back on track as long as he's healthy against Seattle. Moving on to Jaylen Waddle, the final of our wide receiver ones that I wanted to mention. If Jaylen Waddle, who's currently dealing with a groin injury, is going to be healthy, then I absolutely want to play him because we know the level of, wide receiver he is. In my opinion, he's the number one of this team. And quite frankly, if he wasn't dealing with a question and a short week regarding the potential injury, I would probably have him higher ranked than Tyreek Hill at the moment. But considering there are so many questions regarding the scenario, we have it in a sense where, yes, he's still a wide receiver one, but we got to be careful. Because if he is not going to be at a full capacity, that could very easily hurt us to start our week. Nonetheless, thus far this season, Jaylen Waddle has had 30 targets, while Tyreek Hill has seen 29. That just gives you even more of a confirmation as to the level at which Jaylen Waddle will continue to be utilized within this offense. And in a must-win game against an AFC rival on Thursday night, if Jaylen Waddle is at a full capacity, I'm expecting him to have an explosive top 12 game. All right, let's go ahead. Let's throw up the graphic for today's video. Our top 12 for week 4 of the 2022 fantasy football season. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We will have updated rankings this upcoming Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel. Live streaming, kickoff with Kirk. We live stream every weekend, both Saturday and Sunday. So if you're interested, be sure to click the bell notification button so you're notified when I'm live streaming, when I'm up, and helping you guys out with up-to-date rankings on screen for all 4 primary positions. And I do mention defensive rankings, all that kind of stuff, answering questions to the best of my ability. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver 2 conversation, beginning with CeeDee Lamb. He was incredible on Monday night against the New York Giants. And in the last 2 weeks, he has continued to surprise me and be better than I anticipated. A couple weeks ago, I had him as my number 31 ranked. He obviously, he outproduced that in a half PPR by a couple ranks, but just him doing that alone was fantastic. Then last week, I had him as my number 19th ranked wide receiver in terms of the video. And he went certainly past that, had himself a touchdown, very easily could have had himself another 32 receiving yards, if not a 52 receiving yard touchdown on top of what he was able to do at the end of the game with that with that one-hand snag where he just brings down a touchdown and is dominating against his defense. Nonetheless, we trust that Cooper Rush can get him the ball. And that's all we need to do. If we can trust that, and the fact that this man has gotten himself 11 targets in every single game thus far this season, we're going to get ourselves on a path where CeeDee Lamb is trending towards that top 5 standing at the end of the year. In the last 2 weeks alone with Cooper Rush, he has sustained a 37.09% target share within this offense. That in itself is an incredible number. And if it continues to trend towards 40, oh my goodness, CeeDee Lamb, the amount of value he has, on top of the fact that he has a matchup against the Washington Commanders this week, I think this is going to be an absolute incredible game for him. That is why he sits as our number 13. Moving on, we have Christian Kirk, a wide receiver that, as of thus far this season, has put up 3 consecutive performances of plus 14 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. He's top 5 within red zone targets inside the 5-yard line amongst the wide receiver position. And going forward, he's going to continue to be in that conversation because this offense actually looks like they can continue to put up a great number of fantasy points regardless of what defense they play against. Now, they've done that against the Los Angeles Chargers last week, but they're going to have their real test against the Philadelphia Eagles, an undefeated squad who defensively have really tightened up in the last couple weeks. That being said, if we're going to have Christian Kirk with 5 red zone targets lead to 3 receiving touchdowns in the last couple weeks, I'm expecting him to get more utilization down in the red zone, and when opportunity knocks, he's going to deliver for us once again. Moving on to Marquise Brown. Marquise Brown takes on the Carolina Panthers, and the fact that he had a total of 17 targets, 14 receptions, that was the second most targets that we have seen thus far this season. That in itself just kind of gives you an indication as to the kind of combination we were really anticipating to see from Marquise Brown and Kyler Murray when this trade was made. And the fact that there is no D-Hop, and there's a potential that he can continue to get this level of targets until the return of DeAndre Hopkins, it gives us a lot of hope. Now, in the last 3 weeks, we've seen Marquise Brown garner a 29.31% target share. And as long as AJ Green, who is currently dealing with an injury, is going to miss some time, perhaps even Greg Dortch is going to miss time, We don't know if Rondale Moore is going to be active this week. They're anticipating that he could return. But if, in fact, a lot of these other wide receivers are going to be missing from this upcoming weekend's contest against the Carolina Panthers, I'm expecting Marquise Brown's opportunities to look a lot similar, not exact, but very eerily similar to what we saw this last weekend. Moving on to T. Higgins, our number 16, who should be able to participate in this upcoming Thursday night's game. He's dealing with a toe injury, but everything we've heard from head coach Zach Taylor is that he is ready to play. Now, this all being mentioned, just this last weekend, unfortunately, T. Higgins had 11.8 fantasy points. But just to put this in perspective, the last catch that he made was when there was 10 minutes remaining in the second quarter. On top of that, he also had a touchdown stolen from him by the referees. Easily, if you go ahead and watch that replay, he's got both feet down at the back corner of the end zone. And the fact that that play wasn't reviewed properly and wasn't granting him a 6-point touchdown plus all the yardage is ridiculous. We've sort of very easily seen a 20-point performance out of T. Higgins within the first quarter alone. The amount of production he was putting forth was absolutely ridiculous, and it was great to see. That all being mentioned, I think as long as we're going to continue to be in line with T. Higgins getting the similar amount of targets as one Jamar Chase, and Jamar Chase is going to pull Xavier Howard onto the other side of the field, T. Higgins always is in that, low-end wide receiver 1, high-end wide receiver 2 conversation every single week. Moving on to Amari Cooper. I got to put respect on this man's name. He has an incredible matchup. He takes on A.J. Terrell and this Atlanta Falcons secondary. A.J. Terrell has already given up 5 receiving touchdowns this season alone, and I'm expecting perhaps a 6th for this upcoming week. Based on what we've seen in the last 2 weeks of Amari Cooper's production, having seen a target share of 36.2%, having scored a touchdown in each of the last 2 weeks. If you just want to talk about the target competition at the wide receiver position at the within the Cleveland Browns, it's ridiculous. In the last 2 weeks alone, other wide receivers on this team have only totaled 6 targets, while Amari Cooper has been able to surpass double-digit numbers each of the last 2 weeks. Considering the fact that we have such a strong run game from the Cleveland Browns, always present, and especially that's going to be something that the Atlanta Falcons want to key in on and potentially stop, it makes it that much easier for Jacoby Brissett in play action to make a lot of plays. Again, thus far this season, Jacoby Brissett has had a 78 passing completion percentage in terms of play action plays, which continues to open up more opportunity for Amari Cooper to dominate against opposing defenses. Moving on to Courtland Sutton. Listen, Courtland Sutton has been fantastic, and despite the fact that he is yet to score a touchdown thus far this season, he is still the number 23 overall wide receiver ranked in a half PPR scoring format. Now, we all know, for those of us who have watched the games in the last couple weeks for Courtland Sutton, that 2 of his touchdowns were called back. Very easily could have had himself even more fantasy points and would be in that top 12 conversation easily by the end of the season. Now, going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, I think it's relatively neutral. It's going to be a matter of who ends up stepping up and making plays. And the one person I'm looking at that has to make plays is Russell Wilson. Despite the fact that Russell Wilson has helped elevate Courtland Sutton to getting 4+ receptions and 72+ receiving yards in each of the last 3 games, we still haven't seen very good productivity out of Russell Wilson. In fact, in the last 2 weeks alone, Russell Wilson has only had a 53.12% passing completion percentage. That level of accuracy and just offensive efficiency is not there for Russell Wilson. So we're hoping to continue to see this offense go in the right direction. When Courtland Sutton is accounting for 40% of the receiving yards in this offense already, that is concerning. But for us fantasy managers, we'll take it and we'll continue start him every single week. Moving on to Drake London, taking on the Cleveland Browns. Drake London has been the special number 1 wide receiver, the guy taken first off the board at the wide receiver position in the NFL draft, and he's pretty much following in the footsteps of Justin Jefferson, of Jamar Chase, Jaylen Waddle from seasons past. Early drafted wide receivers in the first round who make immediate impacts in the National Football League. As of the last 3 weeks, he's had a 31.64% target share. Marcus Mariota 100% believes that he is the number 1 of this offense, and that'll continue to be the case. Obviously, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen the Cleveland Browns suffer against specific wide receivers. Last week, Diontae Johnson, 8 catches led to 84 receiving yards. Garrett Wilson the week before, 8 catches, 102, and 2 receiving touchdowns. It's just a matter of whether or not Marcus Mariota is going to let the ball loose. I'm expecting him to do so. He's played extremely well in the last couple of weeks, and it's only going to elevate this offense and Drake London's potential upside. Moving on, we have Mike Williams as our number 20 taking on the Houston Texans. Even though this is one of the easiest matchups of the week, and his cornerback coverage is most likely going to be Derek Stingley Jr., the rookie cornerback out of LSU, I still believe that Mike Williams is going to, be at the mercy of whether or not Justin Herbert's healthy. The fact that this offense really hasn't looked great already thus far this season. They haven't looked like themselves of old. We're going to deal with offensive line injuries. We're still dealing with Justin Herbert and his recovery process. They might just run the ball the entire time because, truth be told, the Houston Texans are one of the 2 worst teams in terms of stopping the run. And if they just hand off the ball to Eckler 30 times, I wouldn't be surprised. Luckily for Mike Williams last week, his 1 reception on those 6 targets led to a touchdown and saved his week. But as of this moment in time, yes, there is a lot of potential going up against Derek Stingley Jr. We saw Michael Pittman week 1, 9 catches, 121 and a touchdown against his defense. Week 2, we saw Courtland Sutton, 7 catches, 122 against his defense. Big body wide receivers that have a lot of potential. But it's going to be a matter of whether the other pieces in this offense can help Mike Williams get to that level. Moving on, we have Gabriel Davis as our number 21. Gabriel Davis was active for majority of that game. In fact, he played 96% of the offensive snaps. Now, if you're going to play that much of the snaps and you're not going to be effective, you're really just a distraction at that point. And that's what I really saw him as within that offense. Getting a lot of utilization out of Devin Singletary and Isaiah McKenzie within that offense besides Stefon Diggs. Davis was a distraction. Coming off that ankle injury, now is in a situation where maybe he can go ahead and get back on track as a primary receiving threat that could get double-digit targets in this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Baltimore Ravens. Let's not forget, Jaylen Waddle, Tyreek Hill, and Devontae Parker have all surpassed 150 receiving yards each against this defense in the last 2 weeks. I understand that there may be a conversation of Isaiah McKenzie getting more targets, potentially Dawson Knox, or even Devin Singletary maintaining as a receiving threat. But in one of the easiest wide receiver matchups of the week, I'm expecting this team to key in and once again reestablish Gabriel Davis. Moving on to Keenan Allen, the other end of this Chargers conversation. We just talked about Mike Williams just moments ago. If Keenan Allen is healthy and is returning this week, he should be in a good position. Let's not forget, with Justin Herbert, when they've both played full healthy games since 2020, Keenan Allen has averaged 14.16 half PPR fantasy points per game. They take on the Houston Texans, and in my opinion, this is an easy enough matchup to where the number 1 receiver of this offense, which we know is Keenan Allen, by virtue of just targets alone, he's going to get himself his utilization. Just putting it in perspective, in the last 27 games healthy that Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen have played together, 19 of those games have accounted for double-digit targets going in the direction of Keenan Allen. I'm expecting a lot of production. He's just got to be healthy, and Justin Herbert has got to look like himself this upcoming week. Moving on to Curtis Samuel, our number 23, taking on the Dallas Cowboys defense. Again, if Curtis Samuel is going to continue to average nearly 10 targets per game, then he's in a perfect position to succeed. I mean, the fact that he only has 23.07% of the target share within this offense is kind of, skewed in the direction of, yes, this is a pass-heavy offense. You have to put that into perspective. They're throwing the ball 40 or more times per game as of the first 3 weeks of the season. If that continues to maintain and Curtis Samuel continues to play 80+% of the offensive snaps, whether it is on the ground, through the air, he's going to get his opportunity and potentially take care of that this upcoming week going up against the Dallas Cowboys. Again, with Terry McLaurin most likely pulling Trayvon Diggs on the other side of the field, Curtis Samuel could have himself a pretty good week here as our number 23. Moving on to the final wide receiver in our wide receiver 2 conversation, we finish off with DK Metcalf, who had himself a receiving touchdown in a pretty big week. 12 targets that had him, only 5 catches. We understand that it's going to improve as the weeks progress, but was able to get himself 64 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. Now, when I watched this game back this weekend, I wanted to specifically look at the incompletions that Geno Smith and DK Metcalf had. Now, a lot of the scenarios, it was Geno Smith really just not putting the ball in the right place, but there was also a drop by DK Metcalf. There was also really good coverage by AJ Terrell, and there was a couple scenarios where out the back of the end zone, in the red zone, we have ourselves DK Metcalf coming down with the ball, but wasn't able to get both feet in bounds. A lot of out-of-bounds situations like that could very easily switch up a 15-point fantasy week to a 25-point fantasy week. It just takes one little toe getting in bounds. Nonetheless, as long as the opportunity is going in this direction, they take on the Detroit Lions. I know that, Okudah really did shut down Justin Jefferson last week, but Adam Thielen, KJ Osborne, both of them had pop-off performances, just putting it into perspective as to how easy this matchup is and why I've designated it as a 4-star matchup. AJ Brown in week 1, 10 catches, 155. The Washington wide receivers in week 2, 7 for 78 in a touchdown, 4 for 74, and 4 for 59 in a touchdown. And then, of course, this last week, Thielen, 6 catches, 61 in a touchdown. Osborne, 5 catches, 73 in a touchdown. A lot of potential here for DK Metcalf. All right, let's go ahead. Let's once again give you guys a look at our wide receiver twos going into week 4. Do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We will have rankings available Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time via our live stream. So be sure to click the notification button. We'll be live streaming both Saturday and Sunday of this weekend. So if you're interested, you can swing on by, get those rankings, get those questions answered before kickoff with Kirchhoff. Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to the wide receiver 3 conversation, beginning with Chris Olave. Now, going into week 4, the question is Michael Thomas healthy? Is Jameis Winston healthy? And can this team figure it all out in London? As of this current moment in time, I believe that Chris Olave is slowly but surely becoming the number 1 wide receiver of this offense. The way that Jameis Winston is utilizing him looks very similar to the way that Jameis Winston utilized Chris Godwin a couple years ago when he was with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and elevated Chris Godwin to being, the number 2 overall wide receiver while they were both healthy together throughout that season. Now, in the last 2 weeks, we have seen back-to-back weeks of Chris Olave getting himself 13 targets within this offense. Now, we had him as a breakout potential must-start candidate in last Friday's episode, and for those of you who had him available on your waivers and gave him a shot and picked him up before this last weekend's performance, we saw a lot of deep passing opportunities for him. And when Jameis Winston is going to continue to be at the top of that category in terms of quarterback passing attempts, 20 or more yards down the field, by all means, we should expect a lot of touches going in the direction of Chris Olave because he's talented enough. He leads the Saints wide receivers with 29 total targets, and if that's going to continue to be the case, just wait till the touchdowns begin to rack up. That is what's going to separate him and elevate him to the next level. Moving on to Diontae Johnson at number 26. Diontae Johnson has been relatively quiet this season. He's only put up, average numbers, 10 to 12 points, but he's getting the job done. And he's been able to continue his streak of double-digit targets. And, from what we've heard from even Mitchell Trubisky in the last couple of weeks, he has even publicly said that they're still trying to figure out when to allow him to make audibles. This is an offense that is going to tell him what to do, and he knows, okay, I got to take a 3-step drop and I got to throw it in the direction of Diontae Johnson, who's playing 98% of the offensive snaps and is always going to be open. In fact, when you go ahead and look at the article that was posted by ESPN just earlier this week in terms of how often wide receivers get open, and the amount of separation that they've created in the last 2 seasons already, Diontae Johnson is only behind A.J. Brown and Stefon Diggs in terms of separation and the ability to get open, according to their metrics and their analyzing, of that in the last 2 years. In my opinion, it's obvious. We've talked about this. You don't get targets because, they're funneling it in your direction. You're getting targets because you're open, and that's what Diontae Johnson has done week in and week out. They take on the New York Jets. We have seen, of course, multiple wide receivers succeed against them. Week 1, Baltimore Ravens, 6 catches, 113 and 3 touchdowns between Duvernay and Bateman. Of course, we saw Amari Cooper in week 2, 9 catches, 101 and a touchdown. We saw the Cincinnati wide receivers of Boyd, Higgins, and Jamar Chase last week combined for 15 catches, 227 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. I'm expecting a big week out of Diontae Johnson and hopefully Mitch Trubisky. Moving on to DeVonta Smith. Listen, I think he's played absolutely great in the last 2 weeks, and that is continuing to give me confidence to move him into this top 24, top 36 conversation because as long as you are associated with one of the top offenses in the league, you are going to get ample opportunity. And what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, Jalen Hurts surpassing 300 plus passing yards in each of the last 2 games, a stat that he was only able to accomplish in 2 of his games last season. Already accomplishing that twice in the first 3 games is massive. Now, DeVonta Smith has begun to really look like the Heisman winning wide receiver that he once was. And now that we're getting ourselves into scenarios where A.J. Brown is pulling majority of the top tier coverage, the number 2 wide receiver of this offense is going to equally benefit because of that, pressure that is pulled onto the other side of the field. And the fact that, every defense has to maintain and contain what Jalen Hurts provides in the running game. I mean, there's a lot of plays to be made and a lot of fantasy points to be earned, especially against the Jacksonville Jaguars defense, who have struggled against wide receivers thus far this season. Moving on to Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin had himself a pretty good week this last Sunday. I mean, even though they had a matchup in which they didn't score any points offensively, we were still in a conversation where Terry McLaurin was able to get himself over 100 receiving yards and 6 catches on 9 targets. Incredible. We love it. But in the last couple weeks, Terry McLaurin has been the number 25, the number 37, and the number 21 overall ranked wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format. And if we're going to be associated with a pass-heavy offense who's throwing the ball 40 or more times a game, we're anticipating that Terry McLaurin is going to at least get 8 to 10 of those every single week. And if that's going to be the case, regardless of the coverage from a Trayvon Diggs, we're going to be in a scenario where we're expecting Terry McLaurin to put up ample amount of fantasy points to maintain a wide receiver 3 standing. Moving on to Michael Thomas. Like we mentioned a little bit ago with Chris Olave, we don't know the status of him this week, but we are anticipating that he can stay healthy, and if he's able to do so, then he should play, and he should play well. Of course, Jarvis Landry and him both didn't practice today, which is a little bit concerning. They are in London for that London game. Do not forget that start time is very early Sunday morning. So if you have any players in that matchup, you got to be sure to make sure that everything is lined up and ready to go prior to that kickoff. Nonetheless, I'm expecting that this foot injury that they've designated the reason why he didn't practice isn't having to do with his ankle. If it is, that is something that I am beginning to worry about. Hopefully it's not going to be the case, and we're going to see a full Michael Thomas at a full capacity, because only last week he played 68% of the offensive snaps, and it showed based on his total fantasy point contribution to us. Moving on to Garrett Wilson at number 30. We don't know exactly what Zach Wilson is going to look like. Is Zach Wilson going to be the next coming of one of these great quarterbacks? As we've seen, Jalen Hurts take steps forward as a young quarterback. We've seen, players like Trevor Lawrence this season take steps forward and make massive improvements. These young quarterbacks year in, year out are going to make improvements. Now, is Zach Wilson going to join them in one of these quarterbacks that is going to make a massive improvement? Hopefully that's going to be the case. A couple of the detrimental factors is the fact that we don't know whether or not he's going to target Corey Davis, whether he's going to target, potentially Tyler Conklin, Elijah Moore. Those have been the guys that he liked to utilize in seasons past. But we just don't know if Garrett Wilson is going to be that go-to come week 4 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, the Steelers secondary, in my opinion, is not fantastic. And if we're going to have a situation where, Zach Wilson's got to get the ball out of his hands relatively quickly, and you may be wondering, why does that have to be the case, Andrew? Why does he have to get the ball out of his hands? Well, all 3 of the left tackles for this team that they had signed are all on the injured reserve. So they're going to send a lot of pressure in that direction, his blind side, and if they can get to him and cause him a little bit of uncomfortability, it could end up ruining the day of a Garrett Wilson potentially, but we're hoping that's not going to be the case. Moving on to Tyler Lockett at number 31. We have seen back-to-back weeks from Tyler Lockett of 11 targets and 9 catches. As long as he is in this conversation, by all means, he has incredible value. We have seen the Detroit Lions secondary, like we mentioned with DK Metcalf, give up a boatload of points. A.J. Brown, in week 1, 10 catches, 155 against this defense. All 3 primary wide receivers for the Washington Commanders had themselves great performances. 7 catches, 78 yards and a touchdown. 4 catches, 59 yards and a touchdown. 4 catches, 75 yards. And in this last week, Thielen, Osborne, both scored touchdowns, both surpassed 5 receptions, both surpassed 60 receiving yards. There's a lot of potential here, and as long as Geno Smith continues to look in the direction of Tyler Lockett, it makes me begin to think that Russell Wilson wasn't the great quarterback. It was these receivers that were elevating him to the next level. Moving on to Brandin Aiyuk. Has a great matchup against the LA Rams. With Jimmy G at quarterback, we know that there's not going to be as much of a mobility factor, and the quarterback keeping it himself and running, they're going to have to get the ball out of Jimmy G's hands. And what they've gone ahead and done over the last couple contests against the LA Rams, whether it was during the regular season, week 18, where we saw Brandin Aiyuk put up 8.9 fantasy points, or was the NFC Championship game in which Brandin Aiyuk had himself 13.7 fantasy points, a lot of opportunity has gone in his direction. In fact, 6 catches, 107, 4 catches, 69. Those are the overall productions of Aiyuk recently against the LA Rams when he was out of the doghouse and in a conversation of being a primary receiving option. I'm expecting that continuing to be the case this upcoming week, as Kyle Shanahan has the LA Rams number, beating them 6 out of the last 7 games. Moving on to Brandin Cooks. Man, Brandin Cooks has been quite disappointing this season. I really expected more production out of the amount of targets that he has seen. Luckily, this week he takes on the LA Chargers. That secondary got completely brutalized by not only Zay Jones, Marvin Jones, but also Christian Kirk. The running backs had themselves a feast, and the only person that didn't play well was Evan Ingram. What a surprise. But nonetheless, if in fact we're going to see a potential in which J.C. Jackson isn't active once again, we have seen Asante Samuel Jr. give up a lot of receiving work to opposing wide receivers. I could end up seeing a big week out of Brandin Cooks, but we're going to be a little bit, conservative with the idea of starting him as a primary guy. Maybe as a flex option, he could get the start this week. Moving on to Romeo Doubs. Romeo Doubs seems to be vying for the number 1 opportunity within this offense as a wide receiver. Now, Allen Lazard is the main veteran, and Allen Lazard is most likely going to get the first crack at it. But in my opinion, the amount of utilization in terms of 8 targets, 8 catches, playing 89% of the offensive snaps, that is all leading in the direction of Romeo Doubs continuing to be a main part of this offense. And from what I heard from Aaron Rodgers when he was doing his interview on Tuesday with Pat McAfee, he continues to talk so highly of Romeo Doubs, saying he always wants to learn. He's always up to the task at hand. He acts like a veteran. He acts like he's been here before. These are things that we love to hear. And if Aaron Rodgers is excited about the potential of his receiver, of course, the ball is going to be going in his direction. Moving on, let's talk about our number 35, Adam Thielen. Last week, I had him as my number 36, and I mentioned, quote unquote, I don't want to give up on Adam Thielen because once I do, he's going to score a touchdown. And what did he do last week? He scored a touchdown. That's why I didn't want to give up on him, because we know that he is a touchdown machine. And I know that this offense has been struggling, and Justin Jefferson has kind of disappeared. And if that's going to continue to be the case, and if the running game is going to slow down due to the fact that, Dalvin Cook is dealing with that, shoulder injury, and the New Orleans Saints defense has been typically good in terms of stopping the run, Adam Thielen could very easily step up to the task at hand, get himself a wide majority of targets. Now, in terms of the conversation of red zone opportunities, he's had the 13th most targets within the 10-yard line thus far this season, and that continues to rise as the weeks progressed. Moving on, we have JuJu Smith-Schuster as the final wide receiver I wanted to mention. When I'm thinking about the potential matchup on hand, and the fact that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are extremely good at stopping the run, that is going to force a lot of opportunity for these receiving threats to potentially step up, whether it is Travis Kelce, JuJu Smith-Schuster, and maybe the running backs, because Mecole Hardman, currently questionable, didn't practice today. Marquez Valdes-Scantling looks like a waste of money. And outside of that, there really isn't anyone else. I'm expecting JuJu to step up, and as long as he continues to play more and more and sees an ample amount of opportunity, fantasy points will arrive. All right, let's go ahead, throw up the final graphic for today's video, giving you an idea as to the wide receiver 3 conversation. Don't forget, rankings are subject to change as the week progresses. Injuries are going to be designated. We'll get more information regarding all this information, and we'll make our better decisions on Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy and use promo code Andrew. Again, like I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of potential pick'ems to play, putting together pick'em slips higher or lower on a given player statistic, potentially participating in the Thursday night contest, drafting players and competing against others. Check that out today. Use promo code Andrew. And when you do, when you make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.